Hello, welcome to another episode of Shattered Lives, the Irish Daily Star's crime podcast. I'm crime correspondent Michael O'Toole. We have a real treat for you today. I've been speaking to an Irish man called Chris Reynolds. He has a riveting story. Chris has had a unique career path in law enforcement and in the emergency services in general that spanned more than 40 years. He was a naval service officer, the head of the Irish Coast Guard, and then ended up leading a maritime and policing operation in one of the world's most dangerous cities. Chris opened up to us about his eventful career. He tells us how he helped recover hundreds of bodies from the waters of the southwest coast of Ireland after the Air India disaster in the mid-1980s. And he talks about how he became caught up in a horrendous massacre of more than 100 people when he was working as a UN peacekeeper in Lebanon in the 1990s. Finally, Chris tells us how he spent years trying to restore law and order to lawless Somalia in East Africa and how he managed to do that under constant threat from terrorists. Chris Reynolds, a very interesting character, and I would say unique, in my opinion, in Irish blue light or Irish emergency services circles, and hopefully our listeners on Shattered Lives will get a good picture of why I consider your career is unique. So just to recap, the last few years you have been in Somalia, in East Africa, the Horn of East Africa. Now, most people will, when they consider Somalia, will think that it's a failed state and they will think of piracy. Now, I'm going to get the view of an expert on you on this, but you were there as the civilian head of EUCAP, which is it's a European law enforcement mission.
Okay, so the European Union, the European member states have a common foreign security policy. It is the common policy in our foreign affairs and security policy, and there are certain tools within that policy. One tool is called the CSDP, some Common Security and Defence Policy, and within that there are missions that the EU launches abroad, both civilian, military, both executive and non-executive. And so my mission was a civilian, non-executive mission.
And did I read somewhere that you would have been the first Irish head of an EU mission?
That's correct. We had force commanders before, but that's different. Force commander is simply appointed by the state that is hosting the force. But I was the first Irishman to be a EU head of mission. Now, head of mission in EU terms is an ambassador. So it is an EU ambassador level concept, and you apply and you go through interview process, etc. So I was lucky to be Ireland's first, and so far only.
Okay, and is that something you take pride in?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It is. I've been 44 years involved in uniformed service. And this, to me, was a culmination of that 44 years.
Okay, so we're going to get into what EUCAP is later on in the interview, but I'd like to go backwards to go forward. So you started off, if I'm correct, as an officer in the naval service.
Correct.
So tell us a bit about that.
Okay, sure. I left school in 1979 and pretty much went straight into the Navy, into cadets. In those days, the cadets were sent to the Royal Navy to train. So I spent the best part of three and a half years with the Royal Navy training in their officer training scheme.
Is that Dartmoor?
Dartmouth, yes. It's the Navy standards. In fact, Prince Andrew was there at the same time as me. It's something I've had to take off my CV recently, but it was something on my CV in the old days. And that was really interesting. We were treated quite well, particularly given the Falkland Wars on the time. And it could have been difficult, but it was fine. So most of my career was either driving ships, and my main specialization was as a diver, as the head diver of the Navy, and that included bomb disposal and improvised explosive device disposal. So that was a big area of my work. So early on, I became very used to recovering lost people who drowned, been suicide. My ship Aisling was the on-scene coordinator at the Air India disaster. If you remember, 1986, the first terrorist bombing of a jumbo jet. And so the concept of looking for missing people and recovering missing people, and that element of work was already in my kind of DNA early on in my career.
You've raised two things there. I have to ask you first, what was Prince Andrew like? Did you have any dealings with him?
He wasn't very popular, I'd say. And I have plenty of stories about Prince Andrew. But for example, if you're playing soccer in the soccer pitch, you'd have to call him Your Royal Highness to Prince Andrew, please pass the ball. Whereas when Charles now went through, they were much more informal and very popular, where Prince Andrew was much more formal and standoffish. So it's definitely less popular. And I've loads of stories about his time there that would take some time.
Okay, so secondly, and more importantly, I suppose the Area India disaster, I was 15, 16 when that happened, so it's etched in my memory. So along the lines of, you remember the Don Tidy kidnapping, and John O'Grady, so they all sort of happened around the same time in the mid to late 80s. And just for younger listeners, Area India, it was flying from Canada. Was it flying from Canada or to Canada?
So flying from Canada, going to India for people taking me home for festivals and stuff. So it was full. And it blew up midair. It was part of the Sikh issue, the issue with the Sikhs and at home. And just so to be, for full disclosure, I just arrested a British Spanish trawler, literally as the plane blew up pretty much overhead. So my captain said, take that fishing vessel into Castellamber, arrest it, and we'll go off and we'll deal with this. What was then just a Mayday. We didn't know what it was going to be. And the captain kidnapped me and tried to take me to Spain, to Vigo. And so I had to be rescued myself on the day of the Air India and then get back to my ship via various ways. Okay,
you're a man of many, many stories, Chris. What do you mean he kidnapped you?
They kidnapped me because they didn't want to be arrested, and my ship had just left me. And I had a gun. I had a Browning automatic, and my NCO had a machine gun, a Gustav, Carl Gustav. Yeah. We're not going to shoot anybody over fish. And what he did then is he pulled out all the fuses from the HF and MF equipment, his long-range comms equipment. So all I had was a basically handheld VHF radio, and we were about 100 miles off the coast. And luckily, Valencia Radio, which later I became the boss of, was able to pick up my handheld because it was such a beautiful, sunny day that the radio waves travel a long way. And Ali Emer came and rescued me. So a bit embarrassing, but that's what happens.
It does. And you probably, I mean, if this was America, that person who kidnapped you may have been Swiss cheese, but I suppose there is an Irish way of doing things, and it is, you're right, can you shoot somebody for fish?
Yeah, well, I put him in and I handed him over to the guards, and the state solicitor at the time was on holidays, so they let him go. I spent years, I found him again, and we did it properly second time.
Tell me, you said that it exploded. I mean, I don't know, was it 30,000 feet? It was the icing. Did you see any of the explosion, or did you see any of the aftermath?
No, we heard nothing or saw nothing. It was simply, it was overdue. The Ciaran air traffic control recognized overdue. It disappeared off the radar, so we were tasked to go look for it. It was only about 8 nautical miles from our location. We heard nothing. And it was a traumatic day for the crew. That was very traumatic. And I certainly, when I go back to my vessel, alongside Hull Bowline and help with the offloading of the bodies, we had 80 bodies on board. It was something that sticks to your. A lot of the crew, I think, had got post-traumatic stress afterwards. I myself suffered from post-traumatic stress for a different reason and a later event. But at the time, it wasn't really recognized when you're dealing with such trauma, especially with children. That it bores into your soul.
Is there anything that can prepare you for that?
Well, I literally recovered hundreds of bodies. I mean, I literally have recovered in my life as a diver, hundreds of bodies. And so you think that would prepare you, but it never prepares you for children. Nothing can prepare you for children.
Okay, and you got into was it the diving school or the diving unit of the Naval Service?
I was diving school and diving. It was both. It was the lot. It was small enough. So I was sent to the UK for a year-long course of Royal Navy, mine warfare and clearance diving officer, and that's the most senior diver you can be. And so when I came back, that was my job to basically build up the diving unit, and we did a reasonable job.
Why did you pick that unit?
It kind of picked me. When I was in Dartmouth, you could do these leave activities. And one of the leave activities that was being offered was diving in Cyprus. So I put that down as my first choice, but not being Royal Navy, I didn't get it. So my divisional officer says, well, Chris, I can give you diving on the south coast of England. I said, okay, I'll take that. Little realizing it was the Navy divers course, which is brutal. It's absolutely brutal, and a failure rate of 80%. Is all the diving courses have. But being a short, ginger Irishman, I was not going to let them grind me down, and I passed the course. So I fell into it, as in with the Coast Guard, with my time overseas. I kind of fell into these things, and I've always had this attitude of, and I used to say to my diving classes, now I use a different word, but I say, just when you think it's all, you're going to give up, just say feck it and do it anyway. And that's been my kind of the way I've lived life. I mean, I've taken jumps into the dark so often, and they worked out, but they mightn't have. But it's always an interesting life to do that.
Was there any? Did you have? And that was the early 80s and late 70s, and there may not have been as politically correct as there were now. Was there any anti-Irish guff you got at Dartmouth?
Royal Marines. I think the Royal Marines were the only ones who gave us a hard time. The Navy guys, no. The Navy guys tend to come from a different stock as well. I'll be honest. The Royal Marines were a little rougher around the edges because they had to be rough around the edges. And during the Falklands and the position Charles Hoy and the Irish government took about the Falklands, and we were there in the middle of it in the Royal Navy. We were an obvious target for some comments. It never got violent. A few comments, but that's all.
Were you called Paddy? I presume you were.
Yeah. But I call him Norman. And they said, "Why are you calling me Norman?" I said, "Us Irish, we call all you Brits Normans. You're just Normans." And he said, "No, you can't do that. That's my name." I said, "Well, my name's not Paddy." Okay, I get your point.
You brought something to mind for me. So in 1984, so I was 13, going on 14. It's amazing the things you remember. I went over with my brother and my older brother. He got his tickets. We went over to the Charity Shield. Liverpool, I can't believe I went to see Liverpool even then as a child. Liverpool versus Everton, great game. But we had hospitality, and bear in mind, we were 13, and we were in having dinner or whatever, and they had a comedian. And like an idiot, the comedian said, "Anybody Irish in the audience?" And like an absolute idiot, I stuck my hand up. And he went, "What's your name, son?" And I went the answer, and he said, "Don't worry, I'll ask you something easier." Right? And you know what? The whole place erupted, laughing at a child. And it just shows you the sort of, for me, it was just this casual racism back in the day. I mean, it's just, imagine taking the piss out of a kid.
Even the TV programs were racist back then. But one of the things that I noticed academically and professionally, I did very well in my time in Royal Navy. In fact, I topped every single course and became first place in everything. And this confused the English something terrible, that an Irish guy could academically wipe the floor with them, and an Irish guy could professionally wipe the floor with them. And they couldn't handle this. And my classmates there, because we had a few Irish there for the Irish Navy at the same time, did very well as well. And they were of the assumption that we are handpicked from the best schools, from the best colleges to be sent over to embarrass to be English. And they couldn't understand it. But no, we're just selected from our leaving certs. And that was it. And that was a form of racism as well. It was a lack of understanding, because the Irish and English at the time were not probably the best regarded.
Now, tell me this. You mentioned there that you did suffer from TSB or develop PTSD, but it wasn't from the area India. It was another incident. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, okay. Towards the end of my time in the Navy, I was asked to go to Lebanon. I was there for a year in Nukura, in headquarters, as a captain. And now the Grapes of Wrath War kicked off, the Israeli-Hezbollah war in 96. And I was the senior captain in Nukura. So I was sent to take charge of the humanitarian convoys out of Kwana. And so we ran the convoys out of Kwana 2-3 times a day. Robert Fisk and other reporters would come with us, and we ran the convoys, and we were the only thing moving. Nothing else was moving. And so the Israelis needed to stop us. They needed a free fire zone. They needed to kill anything that was moving, because that was the way they're going to hit Hezbollah. So they needed to stop us moving. So they just dropped ordnance all over us for the first couple of days. So first 6 days, it was all exciting and thrilling, and it was boys' own stuff. It was just I had no real fear for my own mortality. And then on day 6, we were first convoy after the 4th Mobile Reserve into the Kwana massacre, and that was awful. It was women and children, pretty much women and children, and we put 120 women and children into blankets. What was left of 120 women and children in blankets. But that was what caused PTSD.
So that was, just to contextualize for our younger listeners, that was obviously, you were part of the United Nations Interim Force in 11 in the Irish, well, not the Irish battalion, but the force HQ in Nakora.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, and Kwana was a horrific massacre. If I recall, it was a community centre or a shelter that was shelled by was it the Israeli army or the South Lebanese army, their proxies? It was the Israeli army.
Israeli army.
And they effectively had a shelter, or they had a place where hundreds of people were sheltering.
Yes. The expedition was done deliberately to embarrass the Prime Minister, so the Prime Minister would have to sue for peace, and at the upcoming elections, he'd be defeated in the upcoming elections because he'd be seen as a dove, not a hawk. And that was conventional wisdom at the time.
And it was, you and I would remember Sabra and Shatila in 1982, the really bad by the Christian phalangists after the Israeli invasion of the whole of up to Beirut anyway. But that Kwana massacre, it was one of the most horrific ones because, as you say, it was a targeted artillery strike on a shelter for effectively women and kids.
Yes, correct. But that's not really what gave me the PTSD. What gave me the PTSD was the people who were with me were all withdrawn, and I was just left there, the only one who was there, and we kept on doing the combos and kept on going out, and the shelling got worse, and it got to a point when I was leaving in the morning with the first convoy. I was pretty certain I wasn't coming back. I wasn't. I may be hit today. No, I'm not coming back today. And I would come back and I go out again. No, I'm not going to come back. And I got in. That gets into you after a while, but you still go out. You have your job to do. You go out. And so for the next 6-8 days, I think it was 13-day war, I carried on. But at the end of that, I was pretty frazzled because there was a couple of times when really we should have been hit for what happened around us with the fire Katyushkas from our positions and stuff. But we just got lucky. So when I came back, my wife said to me, "I don't know who you are, but you're not my husband."
Jesus.
Go see somebody. And I came back with quite a good report from the UN and from the military there, and that caused a lot of, believe it or not, it caused jealousy within the service. That they were jealous that I had gone through this and I had this experience and I had these citations, and the jealousy was palpable to the point that I thought, okay, I can't stay in the Navy anymore. It's time to move on. This is not the service for me. When you get treated, I was treated very badly. That's when I got back. And so I left. Okay,
so a couple of questions arise from this. Was the jealousy partly because you were a naval service officer and it's mostly army officers and army people who are in uniform? What was it?
No, the jealousy was that I was senior in my class. I was probably lined up for accelerated promotion. And there were people ahead of me who were also fancy themselves as lined up for accelerated promotion. So this was a guy come back with war experience, with citations for bravery, with the highest awards that you can get when you're overseas service. And I was a threat. And so that was where it came.
Did the Defence Forces offer you, did they provide any counselling? Was their welfare any good for you?
No.
Are you shocked by that?
It wasn't there. It wasn't that. It was before really was understood. So I did go see a social worker who was with the Navy, but the social worker was the wife of my Navy classmate. So, and there was no confidentiality. You had to walk in through the corridors and people saw me coming in and going in. And the rumor spread that I was getting divorced from my wife, that we were having a family breakup and stuff. So it was no. So when I did leave, eventually, I wrote to Defence. I said, listen, I think I need to talk to somebody. And I have to hand it to both Defence and Defence Forces. Said, yes, okay. We've not done this before, but we have an army psychiatrist. Come back and do counselling with him. I did. And it helped and it fixed it. It took about 5 years. It's a slow, gradual, you kind of come out of PTSD slowly. But it took about 5 years before I could say, yeah, okay, that's fine. It's done.
Now, just one technical question. Obviously, UNIFIL missions are 6 months, but I think, was yours have been a year because you were at the headquarters?
No. What happened with me was I was due out the next rotation, and the guy who went to my job, the rotation, he got out there and wanted to be home with his parents. His parents weren't well. So he just left. So I was at sea on a ship, And I got a phone call saying, I had children 1, 2, and 3 years old. I got a call on the Monday saying, Tuesday, so Chris, we want you to come back and we want you to go out to Lebanon for 6 months earlier, 5 months earlier than planned, but stay for a whole year and have to give us the answer today, and you're going out next Monday. And I said, okay, give me a chance to talk to my wife. So I talked to my wife, and when I got off the phone, she said, listen, it's what you want to do. We'll support you, but I need you home now to sort things out before you go. So I called back the Navy head base and said, I want off the ship today. We're alongside Galway. And they said, no, ship's coming back to base on Friday. Stay on the ship on Friday, and you fly out Monday. And I threw a wobbly, and it took me off. And I was in the officer's mess the next day, and a very famous lieutenant commander who was a bit of a scoundrel at coffee says, hey, and he was a total scoundrel. He's passed away now, God bless him. And he said, Lieutenant Reynolds, I heard you were being a bit of a dick yesterday. And I turned and I looked at him in front of all the officers, the command officers. Well, sir, better being a dick one day in my life than all my life. I went, okay, I'm now in serious trouble. I went and I apologized, and he thought it was the funniest thing. Hey, fair play to him. He had the sense of humor to go, okay, no, that was good. That was very good. But maybe not in front of the commanding officer next time. So I went to the commanding officer and said, listen, motions, etc. was fine. I went for pretty much a whole year, which again caused, added to the kind of, he's there for a year, not just 6 months. He's got 2 medals, not 1 medal, and that sort of stuff.
Okay, so there seems to be an awful lot of backbiting in the Defence Forces.
Yeah, but it's a closed institution, and you're competing against your friends for promotion, and you're competing against the people who you share accommodation with. In the Navy, it's even more. So you share lives together at sea, but they're your competition as well if you want to advance within the service. So it's natural. I did enjoy my time in the Navy. I loved my time in the Navy, and I regret not a minute of it. But I think leaving was the best thing I did. I don't think staying my whole career would have been psychologically the best thing for me. I could spread my wings a lot more by leaving the Navy and going to the Coast Guard.
Okay, so at the start of the interview, you mentioned how you have on a couple of occasions have jumped into the darkness, really.
Yes.
So you left the Naval Service as a lieutenant.
Yes, just before I was due to be promoted. I didn't wait for my promotion. Yeah.
So now, obviously, people would know that in the Army, the lieutenant is the lowest ranking officer, or first and second lieutenant. Where is it in the scheme of things in the Naval Service? It's higher up, obviously, isn't it?
Captain. It's the same as a captain. So we've an ensign as second lieutenant, sub-lieutenant is lieutenant in the Army, and a lieutenant is captain. So it's a captain. But in those days, promotion was dead man's shoes. People had to leave before you get promoted. There was nothing else and people in those days weren't leaving because there's no jobs outside. So it was, I'd done 18 years service and had good reports, and yet was still a captain, where in today's Defence Forces, no, you'd be at least a major or commandant.
And you went to the Coast Guard, the Irish Coast Guard, as director, was it? No. I joined as an operations training officer, which was, and I was put into the volunteer services. So next 10 years, my main job was bringing up the volunteer teams we had around the country from being what was very much a dad's army type of organization into a modern volunteer rescue and response service. And that entailed basically rewriting the entire book on how this was done. And I obviously I looked around to look for good examples, and the UK had good examples of how to do this. And that took my first 10 years in the Coast Guard. I then I felt the itchy feet at that point, and there were some things happening within the Coast Guard about some accidents that happened off the southwest coast with the Père Charles and stuff that had it. There was a lot of friction going on about that time. So I moved on. I would join the HSC as the Chief Emergency Management Officer for Mid Leinster and South Dublin, and South Dublin. And within a week, I had done my interviews for director and came back, but I jumped 4 grades. Wow!
So I left as an operation training officer, and came back 4 ranks, 4 grades. That I was a week previously, and the only reason I could do that was I went out, basically became non-Coast Guard and came back in as an external candidate. So again, if I didn't take that jump, they could never have promoted somebody 4 grades and jumped a whole lot of people in the middle, which you can imagine how that was.
A lot of people, I think it's fair to say that the Coast Guard are now regarded as the 4th blue light service. So the guards, the fire service, paramedics, and yourselves are the Coast Guard. Most people would consider the Coast Guard when they see the red and white helicopter overhead. What does the Coast Guard do?
Okay, so a very good question, because people don't understand what the word Coast Guard means. And this is where you have to go back to basics. So guarding your coast. That's what Coast Guard is. You're guarding your coast. Now, you're guarding your coast from multiple things, including the protection and preservation of life, the notification of dangers to people who use the waters, the management of shipping, the response to oil pollutions and all that sort of stuff, and also criminality at sea. That's how you exercise sovereignty. So that's now called the Coast Guard function or Coast Guard activity. And each country does it differently. So just because you've got an entity called Coast Guard doesn't mean it does everything. It probably does it quite a bit. So in Ireland, the Coast Guard, there's about 10 to 11 Coast Guard functions that every state in the world needs to exercise. And the Coast Guard does about 6. And you have other entities that do other functions, like the Sea Fish Protection Authority, like the Garda Síochána, like the Revenue Service. And you have others who support those, like the Navy, like the Air Corps, like the RNLI, like the Community Lifeboat Service, like Civil Defence, all that. So that is the matrix that you put together. And that is a nation's Coast Guard. Just because it's called a Coast Guard doesn't mean it does everything. There are 1 or 2 countries that is true, like Iceland. But that's not, and America would be the same. But that's not the most common form of Coast Guard. Our Coast Guard comes from what we had under the British rule. And so we've just simply kept that format on. I always wanted to see a different form of Coast Guard evolving in Ireland. Just personally, I think that's where we needed to go into the Icelandic, the Danish, and the French models, because there's some really interesting models of how to exercise full integrated sovereignty over your waters that don't necessarily match what we have at the moment.
What would that mean? What would the difference be?
Well, it depends where you want to go with it. I mean, you have these 10 functions. And so when you're talking about bang for buck and efficiencies and effectiveness, there is a paradigm between all these agencies who are involved in law enforcement on the water, rescue in the water, pollution response on the water, customs and revenue activity. There is a paradigm across all those actors. So you start with, we will coordinate together. Come bit right that we will cooperate together. And then next level is we will be interdependent on each other. I will do something so you don't have to do it. You will do something so I don't have to do it. And the best bang for buck you're ever going to get is integration. We integrate the agencies into a integrated system. So, I mean, you're anywhere along that paradigm you want to be. At the moment, we very much sit at the left-hand side, they coordinate and cooperate. It is very difficult to convince organizations and the political class that integration and interdependency is where you get the ultimate bang for your buck. And you see this in lots of various areas. It's topical now because of Sudan and what happened in Kabul, and also Ukraine being a classic example of the EU's actions, the EU's toolbox. It brings a coordinated, cooperated toolbox. It doesn't necessarily bring an integrated toolbox.
And if you think, just what is coming into my head, but when you consider Coast Guard internationally, it's the American model. Now, those guys are tooled up. They've got helicopters, they've got cutters with heavy significant weaponry, I'll put it that way, and they do interdiction, say drugs and that stuff. That would be unfeasible for Ireland, wouldn't it really?
Why not? I mean, see, what the issue is about owning the task. And this is where in Ireland, the military don't own the task. They own defence of the state matters. They don't own the other tasks. And so it is who owns the task And in America, the Coast Guard owns the target, but it is an armed Coast Guard. If you go to France, they have a system called the Secretary General of the Sea and the Prefect Maritime, and it is principally the Navy that owns the task, because under French law, the Navy is allowed to own those tasks. You go to Denmark, what they do is they've got a Coast Guard and Navy. It's the same organization, and the officers pass between the Coast Guard and Navy and Coast Guard throughout their career. When they're wearing their Navy hats, they have warrants that they can detain, they can arrest. They own their function. And then when they move to military, they're defense of the state, extension of power overseas, safety of lines of shipping, that sort of stuff. So you can see how there are models. If you want to go to the most extreme model, you go to Iceland. There is no army. There is no air force. There is no Navy. There's only the Coast Guard. Because Iceland went, well, who's our enemy? No one. What do we need to do? Guard our waters. Protect our people, protect our fishing boats, and then bring that inland as a service to our citizens inland as well as at sea.
Right. So you said at the start when you were talking about the Coast Guard that it's about guarding the coast.
Yes.
Does Ireland adequately guard its coast?
And Ireland guards its coast with a population of 4 million and a budget that it has. We have so much water. Now, what a lot of people don't realise, I think, is that we don't own, you're talking about the 200-mile EEZ. We don't own that. We don't. So we have, our laws extend to 12 nautical miles, about 25 kilometers off the coast. Anything in there, okay, that's ours. The fish are ours. What's on the seabed is ours. The laws of the land extend out there. So that is Ireland. So Ireland extends about 24 kilometers off the coast, off the baselines. After that, the only rights we have under international law are protection and exploitation of the environment and counter pollution and protection of natural resources. So the EEZ is all about the environment and the resources within the environment and protecting that from, say, pollution, that sort of stuff. We don't have the rights to tell foreign warships what to do and what not to do in that EEZ. We don't have rights. That is innocent passage. They are quite entitled to have freedom of navigation in the high seas. Once they go inside 12 nautical miles, different. So people get confused and think we have this massive ocean. We don't really, for when it comes to things like the Russians surveying the pipelines, we don't have the legal authority to tell them to move on. There are very, very restrictive clauses under the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea that allows a coastal state to interfere with the freedom of navigation of any vessel on the high seas.
But do you think even the 12 nautical miles limit are our defences against whatever actor, be they drug smugglers, be they, if the Russians decided that they wanted to go off in our waters, can we adequately protect or defend our territorial integrity as it stands? Okay,
I'm speaking purely personally now. So this is a personal view. So the personal view is that we've never really looked at what we really want from our defence forces. We kind of knew when I was growing up. We defended against the threat from the north and the activity of the IRA, and we serviced our UN commitments. We knew that was it. That's kind of gone now. The internal security issue is no longer an issue, not really. Our role of the UN, the role of the UN military is, to be honest, it's waning. And globally it's waning. We don't have a regional influence, regional pacts, regional forces that now intervene much more than the UN. UN don't do peace enforcement. They don't go and force a peace. They'll go and look and monitor peace. They don't enforce it. So first thing, that what I think Ireland as a mature nation is to do. So what do we want? What actually do we want from our uniformed forces? Are we looking at something that is looking after our national needs, and then when our national needs allow us to extend power overseas or extend power outside our national needs, then we can use it. So, for example, the conversation about heavy lift or strategic lift aircraft through Sudan came in. My thinking on it is that, does Ireland need that strat lift 24/7, 365? No, we probably don't. We don't have the capacity. We don't have the use for it to maintain that competence and that skill set. We don't have that. When I was in Somalia, we needed strat lift. We had a lot of insecurity in Somalia, and I had to be able to evacuate what was nearly 200 staff out of Mogadishu and the various field offices at a drop of a hat. But I didn't have aircraft, and nor does the EU centrally have aircraft. There's an EU Air Transport Command for sure. You have to sign up to that, and Ireland hasn't. But there's no central. So what I did, and what most EU actors would do, would be I'd enter bilateral understanding. So what I did. We talked to Spain, we talked to France, we talked to Italy, all who had actors and capacity in the area, not just out of Djibouti, but also in Nairobi and other places, and said, okay, if we need your help, here are the rules of us asking for help. Here's what we do. Here's what you do. Here's where liability and responsibility lies, and here's who's going to pay for it. And then, so we have that ability to call on that, and we did call on it as needed. And during the COVID crisis, and during the breakdown in security in Mogadishu, we did call on it. But at the end of the day, I already had contracted aircraft, so I entered into contracts with commercial companies that will go into hotspots and extract. So I had done it commercially as well. So I had this, if one doesn't work, I got the other way. And that's what Ireland kind of needs, because we're not part of NATO. We're not part of any major armed forces where we have to provide heavy lift aircraft as our job. Somebody else does the tanks, somebody else does the warships, we do the strat lift. That's how the systems work. We're not part of that, so we don't have that need. So first thing we need, what does Ireland need? We need to be able to monitor our waters, for sure. Can we do it at the moment? Do we have radar? No. Do we have enough ships to do that? No, but you'll never have enough ships to do it. There's too much water. You just cannot. Ships cannot do it by themselves. So you need the other systems, the maritime surveillance systems, the satellite providers, the both optical, infrared, all the other things that you use to recognize non-typical behavior in your waters. And that's what it's about, because you never can have ships patrolling everywhere. You have automated systems that identify non-typical behavior, either two ships coming together, ships on a course that they shouldn't be on because they're heading to a different port, all that sort of stuff. And their systems are out there to do that. And also, when it comes to our Army and Air Force, Air Corps, what do we need Ireland? What does Ireland need them to do in Ireland for us? And then does that capacity then allow us to extend that to Chad or to Sudan or to, because it initially we need to look after our own backyard, and when that's done, then you have a fundamental capacity, and once you have that fundamental capacity, it can be deployed. Which I think is a conversation at the moment about Irini and deploying a naval vessel to the Med for Irini. Do we have the bulk to do that? And it's always, we're talking about bulk. To extend power overseas, to extend force overseas, you need bulk at home. And if you don't have bulk at home, well, then you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and Peter is your home turf.
So get it ready for Ireland first, and if it works in Ireland, hopefully it'll translate abroad when needed.
Yes, because you have the capacity, and the capacity is being maintained because there's an Irish need for it. So you have a home capacity to have various things like the CAS aircraft being a classic example, enough naval vessels, patrol vessels, and that sort of thing. So, and say the airlift for the Army Ranger Wing and Army Ranger Wing vehicles, because that may be needed not far away. Actually, it might be needed a lot closer to home. So Ireland needs these things, and once you have them, well then, okay, you need an ad hoc need for going away. So, for example, with Sudan, the Irish in Sudan are not working for the Irish government. They're principally work for the UN. So where does the UN's duty of care come in here for the people they have in Sudan? A good friend of mine, Aidan, is the EU ambassador to Sudan.
Oh, Aidan O'Hara.
Yeah, he's a good friend. Because he's ambassador to Djibouti. I've had dinner with himself and his wife in Djibouti many, many times, and also in Brussels. So he's a good guy, a very good diplomat as well. He's an excellent French speaker, of course, as well. But it's not up for Ireland to have to people extract him. It's up for Europe because he works for Europe, and that's what they did. I think the French extracted him.
Okay, I just want to ask one specific question before we go and talk about your time in Somalia. Yeah. Is Ireland regarded as a weak point for drugs across international drug smuggling? In other words, with our what many people would say porous defenses or systems, is it easy for people, do you think, for cartels to bring drugs, land drugs in Ireland or on the coast and transport them onto Europe? Is that an issue?
Yeah, it's quite complicated. I'll parse the answer slightly. If you're talking about bulk drugs shipments, well then yes. I mean, we've so many ports, so many inlets, so many little places you can land. If you're looking at large bulk transshipments, it's nearly impossible to look after every cove and every crook and every cranny. So yes, for bulk. When it comes to the small packaged, they don't tend to go through the maritime space. They tend to go through the airspace. And from a risk reward point of view, drug smugglers, I think, tend to use a smaller, larger amount, larger frequency than the big shipments they used to do because they lost so much money in the past. So that's the first issue. The second issue is you don't interdict at sea. The last thing you're going to do is interdict a drug shipment at sea. You want them to come ashore, and you want to track them, and you want to get all the links of the chain to those kingpins. But if you interdict at sea, you get the mules. It's a good story in the headlines, but you get the mules.
Those bulk shipments you're talking about, I know you say that they've diminished, but do you think, and you know more about this than I do you think that actually does happen in Ireland? There are major shipments coming through into an Irish cove or an inlet or whatever undetected. Is that something you think happens?
Well, it's happened quite a few times in the past, but not recently. It hasn't been detected recently. And I think that's just the nature of the trade. The trade now, it looks like it's going in large bulk to Africa and then being broken out in Africa and coming up through the systems in much smaller quantity. So I think the risk of getting caught with so much and the cost of getting caught with hundreds of millions worth of drugs, it's easier to go the African route. That seems to be where it's going.
Okay, right. Let's talk about Africa.
Yeah.
Okay, so you went to Somalia as EUCAP. Just remind us, it's obviously the European Union. It's a mission set up to improve policing and maritime security in Somalia.
Yes. Okay. The little background, I suppose, to it is that EU. I mentioned these CSDP missions. Europe has put up 3 missions in that area. So the initial civilian mission was called Nestor, based at Djibouti, and that was an Western Indian Ocean mission. And by 2016, it had succeeded in a lot of its work, and it had distilled down to Somalia only. Inside Somalia, there's a training mission, a military training mission. Initially, the Irish Army were the force commanders for that. One is based in Uganda. When that moved into Mogadishu, the Irish withdrew, and it became a Italian-led mission. It still is an Italian-led mission. And then off the coast, you have the naval fleet called Atlanta. And that's an executive mission. When we say executive, it replaces a state function, like Irene does. So when a state can't do the function, it will ask a foreign fleet to come in and do that function. And in that case, it was Atlanta, which is still there. And so that was my mission. My mission was initially pure maritime, and then with the visit of Federica Mogherini to Mogadishu in early 17, May 17, I met her with the then ambassador and with the Prime Minister, and they looked for the mission to evolve into dual-hatted, both a policing and a maritime, and that's what happened. The member states at Brussels level agreed. And we evolved the mission into being dual-hatted, one leg in the sea and one leg on land.
And so the sea was about building up the maritime capacity of the Somalis, was it?
That was the core goal. We succeeded in some areas and we failed in other areas. So we succeeded in the policy legislation part of it and developing the various policies, signing up to international conventions. On the operations side, on the north coast of Somalia, on the southern side of the Gulf of Aden, where that turns and heads out into the ocean, the most risky area of the passage, we've managed to stand up security coast guards. So we've a coast guard based in Somaliland, and we're currently well on the way to having a properly based coast guard in Puntland, which is the other kind of federal state on that. So that has been very successful. We've stood up forces on the Yemen side. The Yemeni Coast Guard is beginning to get going, and Djibouti have a very good Coast Guard as well. So that bit of the water, which was the real high risk, that has been done. What we did as well is we changed the narrative. My motto was, let's stop chasing pirates. Let's start chasing politicians. Because the reality is, Somalia is so long that if you put the bottom of Somalia in Sicily, it would turn at Bab el-Mandeb, somewhere north of Helsinki, and would finish out in the North Sea. That's how much water, that's how long their coastline is. It is astronomically long, and there's no way a naval fleet can blockade that. And so the way you stop Somalis being pirates is convincing the elders, who would be convinced by the politicians, that this is no longer an acceptable form of crime. There's other forms of crime you can do, but this piracy stuff has to stop. And that worked. There hasn't been a proper piratical attack since 2017, and that was on the north coast, a small tanker, and it was the local forces, the people we work with, who went and took the pirates off the vessel and freed the vessel.
But piracy was very bad.
Yeah.
It was a real issue, wasn't it?
Of course, yeah. It had a huge effect on international shipping. It cost hundreds and hundreds of millions for the shipping industry, which eventually passed on that cost to us.
Okay, so tell us about the land side of your mission.
Okay, so this is the policing side of the house, I think. Okay, so the policing side of the house. So we're based in Mogadishu, and we had two bases up the north. The base up the north are much more stable, so our policing work up there is much more normal policing. It's not constabulary policing, but it's more CID and evidence collection and connecting with Interpol and that sort of stuff. So more normal. In the south of the country, where Al-Shabaab, which is Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorist organization, are very active. We talked to the Somalis, and we said, what sort of policing do you want us to help you build? They want, well, we don't really understand what community policing is, but we do understand how we fire weapons. And so we want you to help us train a police force that can fight and hold ground. So we want the army to do the kinetic activity, with their commando forces to go in, their DNAB forces and their other forces that are trained by foreign armies. They'll do that. They'll do the active fighting. Behind them will come the basic army, and it's a basic army, but they also need to move on. But with them come these robust policing, gendarme type policing. They're called Darwish. And so we helped set up syllabi, headquarters, train and deploy into the area of operations these Darwish forces.
And was it successful?
Insofar as it can be. I mean, you are talking about generational change. So yes, it has been some of it more so. Our work around the Interpol and evidence collection has been very, very successful. When it comes to the Darwish, I think what that led to has been successful. So the concept around the fighting police was always that Somalia didn't have a problem because Somalia could never defeat Al-Shabaab because they could never force generate enough soldiers to fight, kill, and hold. That was never going to happen. So you had foreign forces like the British, the Americans, the Turks coming in, training these commando forces. They can do the killing. But the SNA, you're not a Somali National Army. You're never going to have enough. Never going to have enough. So what you need is fighting police. You want people who live locally to be trained as really basic police officers. but who will fight to hold their villages and will fight to protect their lands, but will be loyal to the center and not loyal to Al-Shabaab. So the concepts around this gendarme, these special police, that's what's happening now. And so we are looking, if you look at Somalia now, there is very active kinetic activity taking place in the bush. There are literally hundreds of Al-Shabaab being killed on a weekly basis. And this is by these forces, these irregular forces. The risk, of course, being at the end of it, is you have to regularize the irregular forces. But that is where the mission is going. And the UN and others.
Okay, so we've all seen Black Hawk Down,
Yep.
and we all know that Mogadishu, from the outside, appears a very dangerous place. Was it a dangerous place?
It's probably the most dangerous city in the world. Obviously, there's a Aleppo place like that where it became, for periods, became more dangerous, but it has been a very, very difficult working environment. The mission did travel out in the city every day, sometimes 2-3 times a day. And we had multiple ministries and multiple police stations, etc., to go to. But we always went in armor. You didn't travel except in armor. And you used very, very sophisticated intelligence tools to know when and where to go and when not to go. As head of mission, you'd be very much a special target. It'd be really a good cherry if they can get you. They did get a UN special representative. Lucas killed them not that long ago. So they really are. They like to get high-profile figures. So for me, I had my own team of bodyguards. So I had 6 bodyguards. They were with me for the 3.5 years I was head of mission. 6 bodyguards. There was 2 worked shift 12 to 12. 12 in the afternoon to 12 next afternoon. Then the other 2 took over and 2 on leave. So wherever I was, going out for a walk, going for lunch, I had 2 bodyguards with me all the time. I had my own armored vehicles. So I was, we took security very, very carefully. Very, very carefully.
Would you have had to have worn body armor yourself? Were you kitted up like that?
Yeah, of course, yes.
Right, okay. And did you ever arm yourself?
No. The rule is that if you carry a weapon at home, you can carry a weapon when you're there. But I didn't carry a weapon in the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard's armed. And
did that not make you feel vulnerable? Would you have felt more secure I know they have your bodyguards, but would you have felt more secure with your own firearm?
No, if you met my bodyguards, you'd be quite comfortable. They're all pretty much all ex-Foreign Legion, and these were tough guys. These are monsters of guys. These are huge men, and they had a huge experience behind them. So no, I was very comfortable with that. And the 1 or 2 times things happened, and they had to react quickly, and I could see how they reacted. It was very professional. Okay, before I went out, actually, one of the things that I was on to Foreign Affairs is a training can do. And they said, we didn't really have anything. But I contacted the Ranger Wing. And they said, listen, Chris, we're going to Chad with Leo Varadkar. And we need to practice our close protection routines. Do you want to be Prime Minister for a day or Taoiseach for a day? I said, let's do this. So they collected me here in my house in Clane. And full convoy, full armour protection. And we did a trip to Kilkenny. We did a tour of the castle as a VIP, as a target, walk around the city, went for lunch, and then back to Ranger HQ for some debriefings for a day. So that was so I could see how it should be done, and the Rangers are superb professionals. They really are superb professionals, and I could see my guys; they were pretty good as well.
Okay, so you mentioned the 1 or 2 incidents.
Yeah,
what were they?
You would have ordnance going off, so you'd be moving around and be bombed close by. You might meet a target, but you might just accidentally be the target. Or we had mortars, so quite often we'd have mortars in around the compound. So a mortar would hit, or we never won, usually 6 or 8 mortars would come in, and my guys would basically be on top of me and have me in shelter in seconds, and would not leave me and would protect me with their lives, I think. So no, I felt very comfortable, and they were very good people. And
you mentioned ordnance landing close by. Was that artillery shells, or would it have been IEDs, or what?
Outside IED, okay, inside IDF.
Okay, so how close were those IEDs that exploded to you?
IEDs, down at 100 meters, 200 meters, not that close.
Oh, hold on a second here. That's pretty close.
Yeah, well, you were at the target. There was somebody else, it was a checkpoint was target. And you just happened to be going through a close by checkpoint or going down the road. And so that was the risk you had. Because we didn't mark our vessels or flag our vessels, unlike the military, who were very, very visible and got hit twice. The military, the Italian convoys, the EUCAP got hit twice the same day, 1 year apart. So they were very visible, where we were not visible. And we varied our routes, varied our locations. And so it was very hard to profile our movement. So if you were unlucky, you were unlucky. They couldn't target you.
But when you say about 100, 200 meters, I presume the shockwave got to you.
Yeah. But I've been through
what's that
before.
like? Yeah, tell us what's that like?
Just have a beer. I've gone through before, and I'm an adrenaline junkie anyway. And you don't do my sort of life without being an adrenaline junkie. And so I just didn't. In fact, it actually livened the conversation for the next while.
Were you ever aware of an imminent threat to your life, an active plot to murder, shall we say?
Not that specific intelligence. There was general intelligence about the type of target they're looking for, where and how it was going to take place. And when we got that intelligence, we just responded to that intelligence and we took mitigation measures corresponding to that intelligence. The most obvious mitigation measure is to not do the movement that day. We did. I remember once I was going out to Villa Somalia, which is where the president is, mostly, and his police commissioner would be. And we're due to go to the port to visit the port authorities in the morning. And that port authority visit was for 9:30, but a bomb went off outside the port at 7:30. Over 50 people were killed in that particular bombing. And I made a decision, no, we're going to go. But we just defer movement. And so we moved up to Villa Somalia, taking a different route in about 12 o'clock. And as we were leaving, going out the particular gate, the people were coming in with the bodies to the beach, where they buried their bodies on the beach within 3-4 hours of the attack taking place. And the people are burying their loved ones on the beach. Went to their Villa Somalia, and when I left, I said to the close protection guy, says, let's go down by the port. I want to see if the roads are open. And went down by the port, and the roads were open. And we drove past the bomb site, and apart from what was left of it was a mangled car. It'd been cleaned up, and people were going about their daily lives. And we passed by and passed again. There were still burials going on as we passed by the beach area. But that's the life. It is just that is the life. I mean, there was one suicide bombing in November 2017, that over 600 people were killed in one bombing in a hotel. It hardly made the news at home. Over 650 people killed in one bomb, and hardly made the news at home.
Did you ever feel frightened?
No.
So you thought you and your team had mitigated the risks?
Yes, to as low as reasonably possible.
Okay, so by the sounds of things, would you have heard explosions and shooting? Would it have been on a daily basis?
Pretty much on a daily basis, yes.
Did you get used to it?
Yes, of course, yes.
Okay, and is there? I'm told that there's in Baghdad, there's a green zone. Would that be the case where?
Yeah, we were in green zone. Yeah, absolutely. So around the airport area, it's called Ciaran district. There's a green zone. So you have layers of protection into the green zone. The outer layer being the Somali layer of protection, the next being the African Union troops layer of protection, and then your own compound would have its own protection system as well. And then inside the compound, your own security people would have their own. So effectively, there's 4 layers of protection. So you cannot break in. That cannot be. That's hermetic sealing. You can't. They have. So Al-Shabaab did succeed in getting in, but never really did serious damage once they got inside the green zone. Really, they didn't do an awful lot once they got inside, because they couldn't get much inside. Maybe a hand grenade, maybe a pistol, something like that. That's all they could get in. So that green zone encompasses about 20 compounds as well as the airport. and about 5 or 6 hotels. So it's a city within a city in some ways, and it's very peaceful in there.
Is it possible to? Did you have as normal a life as you could when you were there?
Yes, you could. I live beside the Indian Ocean. My room, when I opened my window in the morning, the Indian Ocean was only about 15 meters away, and the compound I was in was quite okay. It's a compound life. I was a sailor. I can get used to compound life. But we have a beach, and we can walk on the beach every day. And the beach walk is there and back to down to Fullenta is at 8.5 kilometers. And you can go do that run or do a walk. Your bodyguards come with you, I'm afraid. But you can do that, and inside, you got a gym, that sort of thing. So it's restricted.
Okay, you're back home. You're back home. Was it 4 or 5 months? Is it?
No, only 1st of January.
Oh, very good. Oh, okay, right. Do you miss it?
I do in many ways, but I did 6.5 years out there, so I do in many ways. I have offers to go back. I don't know if I'll take them. I have an offer to go back for a year. I don't know if I'll do it. I think at this stage, I still like adrenaline. So I haven't yet found what I'm going to do next. I'm only 61, and retirement is not on the cards for me. So if any of your listeners have anything interested in going, I could be your man.
It's really hard to top your career. What options are you considering, or what would you like to do?
One of the things I'd love to do is go back into the national coast guarding concept. And what I talked about earlier about at a policy level to look across government at our whole maritime security architecture, not just in stovepipes, to look across all the various activities and what does Ireland need and how does that fit in with our international obligations, and to do a piece of work around this coast guarding function and how we could actually be a model for the rest of Europe, because we have the waters, we have the people. Our Navy, it's a Coast Guard. Our Navy is an armed Coast Guard. Our Navy is the closest thing we have to the US Coast Guard, but it doesn't own its own jobs. So if you think about how do you make the Navy, the Air Corps, Coast Guard, how do we own and share the jobs? So we own the responsibility. And once you own the responsibility, then everything else flows from that.
Okay, is it fair to say you won't need 6 Foreign Legion bodyguards for that, though?
No, but I might need 1 or 2. But I'm a rugby referee. That's why I do. That's my real joy at home. And sometimes I need a bodyguard for that.
Okay, Chris Reynolds, this has been a fantastic interview, and we're very, very grateful. It was really enlightening, and it went down a lot of roads. I just did not see this happening, from Prince Andrew to Air India to Somalia. It was really, really interesting. Thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.